are quite in time. I guess the people will join us. We had a lot of attendees on the Zoom registration. I'm very happy to welcome today Siniša Malešević, dear fellow colleague sociologist, actually, who is chair of sociology in University College in Dublin. And currently, actually, in Amsterdam. Yes, you are for the moment in Amsterdam.
But no, I'm still in Ireland because we cannot travel. But I am part of the. I'm on that fellowship in Amsterdam. Yes, I'm online.
Yes. Yes, currently digital fellow at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies in Amsterdam in their Institute for War, Holocaust, and Genocide Studies. I guess you're coming back slowly again to the issue of violence in working there. Siniša Malešević is a member of Royal Irish Academy from 2010, Academia Europea from 2014, and also associate member of Academy of Sciences Arts in Bosnia and Herzegovina from 2012. He held a lot of research and teaching appointments throughout Europe, in Zagreb, in CEU in Prague, in Galway, in Ireland also, in Brussels, on the School of Economics, etc., etc. And he is a proliferate author, I would say, with, I counted 13 books and over 100 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters, more than 140 invited talks. And I'm particularly happy that 141st is happening in organization of the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory. I'm really sorry that we couldn't have you here in live with us. But at least that we learned through this process that we can have an international audience through Zoom. So there is one benefit at least of this situation. I would mention two books which are among many which you wrote, which were awarded. One of them is Rise of Organized Brutality, Historical Sociology of Violence, published by Cambridge University Press in 2017, which was awarded as outstanding book from the American Sociological Association. And another one, which is basically connected to the issue which we are talking today. This is Ground in Nationalism, Sociological Analysis, published by the same publisher in 2019, which was awarded by Stein-Rocken Award in 2020. I will give you now the floor to present your work on nation-centric world. I'm particularly interested, and there was, maybe you didn't follow, but there was some discussion on Twitter when we announced your lecture, whether nationalism is like passé topic today, but obviously we are very much into this issue again. And I'm particularly interested to hear your lecture, because this is something which you are claiming that we are living, this is the mode of living. It's not really a doctrine, it's not really something which is happening from time to time, but it is really pervasive in our society. So please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gisela, for your kind words. Also for summarizing my talk very quickly. There's no point for me to talk now. Okay, so what I want to do is really, since this is an institute for social theory, I will focus a little bit on more theoretical issues because I do empirical research. I'm a historical sociologist and social theorist, so I will kind of try to combine the two as much as possible. Okay, so the point of this talk is really to kind of shed some light on the centrality of nationhood and nationalism in a contemporary world. And if we look at the way, you know, since the inception of nationhood and nationalism, they've regularly been dismissed as a kind of some sort of a temporary phenomenon, aberration that is going to disappear or decline in some way. And if you look at the intellectuals across the political spectrum from 19th century until present, there's a lot of this kind of very strong view that nationalism simply cannot last. It's seen as a relic of this kind of sectarian past. And it wasn't really taken seriously. That's more important and something I will be talking about. So if you look at the classical liberals, you know, from John Locke and James Mill all the way to Karl Popper, they are kind of very much dismissive of nationalism. I think this is some sort of nuisance, that, you know, we have that in popular irrational tribalism or something, you know, that has to do with the past, that, you know, we've overgrown that. There's no need for that. And, you know, in this enlightened world, there's simply nationalism makes no sense. Then if we move a little bit more to the left, if we look at the socialists and kind of more radical thinkers from Marx to Rosa Luxemburg, we see kind of this also dismissiveness of nationalism and nationhood, or accepting it, you know, it is a vessel for class ultimately. So when we see nationalism, it's seen as an unpleasant side effect of class conflict. What matters is class. Nationhood is really a side issue. Even conservatives, you know, original conservatives, 19th century conservatives, let's say Edmund Burke or Carlyle or Newman, saw nationalism as some sort of a French aberration, you know, something that, you know, French Revolution gave to us. It's a kind of a radical, temporary, extravagant phenomenon movement that is bent essentially to destroy the natural social order. So everybody was essentially dismissing nationalism. And it is often, you know, the key issue here is that they often perceive this to be a leftover from previous times, instead of really understanding that this, which obviously they couldn't in 19th century, but it is really puzzling that we are still using these terms in 21st century. So this has nothing to do with the past. This is a modern thing. And it was only starting to develop in the 19th century. So we don't really have a serious study of nationalism until 1980s. As kind of, it's only really in the 1980s that we have systematic attempts to, you know, that we have theories of nationhood and nationalism. Gellner, Anderson, Greenfield, Smith, all of these very well-known thinkers. But even in these theories, the focus is really more on explaining why nationalism emerges, when it emerges, how it influences societies, how old it is, and not really looking at how central it has been and remains to be, you know, for a foreseeable future. So the focus was on showing that nationalism is modern rather than on understanding why modernity is nationalist. So this is really what matters much more in some respect, and this is what we need to tackle as a sociologist and social theorist. And that's a problem. See, if you look at the mainstream sociology doesn't really offer us much in terms of understanding, you know, kind of this nation-centric world in which we live. Nationhood is largely invisible in social theory. It's under-theorized, under-explored, often taken for granted. You know, the kind of conventional categories are just reified and used as such, you know, and we think and apply them as, and I'll explain what I mean by this, as without theorizing them, without understanding, without kind of dissecting them. And if you look at the people who kind of created these first theories, proper theories in 1980s, there are books obviously from 60s and before that, but kind of proper sociological theories from 1980s, they were not sociologists, you know, by training. Gellner or Anderson or Greenfield or Smith, they come from different fields, and they are kind of in many respects influenced by all this knowledge from different fields, from history, which obviously you need to know history. You cannot explain nationalism without knowing history, but you need to know sociology as well, and lots of other disciplines. So if you look at the classics of sociology, you know, from Marx, Durkheim, Simmel, Martineau, Mead, and others, they devoted very little or no attention to nationalism. The only exception here is Max Weber, who was really the only one who took nationalism seriously and dealt with it. But in some respects, this is really understandable. This was very much a novel sociological experience at the end of 19th century and early 20th century, when sociology was becoming institutionalized as a discipline and other social science discipline. And this nationalism was still a phenomenon very much of the upper and middle social strata. Majority of European populations, not to speak of the rest of the world, remained very much attached to religious, local, or kinship-based networks of solidarity. So in that sense, this makes perfect sense why the classics of sociology didn't really engage with nationalism so much, and other, we can say, political theorists and others. However, it's more puzzling why contemporary social theorists continue largely to ignore nationalism or kind of use a very common sense understanding of nationalism. So if you look at the works of Boudon or Foucault or Luhmann or Latour, Bourdieu, very little or almost nothing on nationalism. Even people who did take nationalism to some extent, studied like Habermas, they provide more kind of normative theories like constitutional patriotism, which isn't really a sociological theory of nationalism. It's more of a normative guide, how to behave in a world in which we live. But then you have a lot of kind of very influential sociologists of the kind of reflexive modernization or second late modernity, Giddens, Beck, Bauman, Castells, all of them have largely been dismissive of nationalism, focusing more on kind of globalization, cosmopolitanism, individualization. And then when they see something like what's happening more recently, it's a surprise. There is no explanation why is this happening the way it is happening. Even, really good books like Hermann Rosa's, Social Acceleration, very original book, is quite dismissive of nationalism. Chapters on globalization and war are really not at the same level as the rest of the book. It's very kind of repeats this very conventional Beck's understanding of the world and things like that. There were obviously, and there are exceptions, and people like Michael Mann and Thiele and Collins, Brubaker, Wimmer, Kumar, they've dealt seriously with nationalism, but they are largely historical sociologists who kind of provide comparative historical analysis of mostly European experience, not exclusively so, but mostly. And they don't really theorize nationalism much. They kind of try to provide analytical guide and look at the way how historically these phenomena have unfolded. So we can say that nationalism studies are fairly rich and diverse today. There's lots of different approaches, but they still do not focus enough on sociological questions. Things like there has been a lot of debate, obviously, on the origins of nations and nationalism, but not much on kind of trying to understand why and how nationalism is still, such a dominant and pervasive a form of understanding the world. Why do we live in a nation-centric world? Why is nationalism such a kind of persistent and malleable ideological force? And also, how is nationalism related to all these other aspects of social life, class and status and gender, sexuality, and many other things? Okay, so that's what I want to do today. I want to look a little bit at how nationalism came to be to what it is and why it's still so persistent, why we still live in the world dominated by nation states. And to do that, I'll start from, I don't know if I can share my screen now. Okay.
We see it, yes. You
do, okay, let's just start. That's great, excellent. Okay, so this is the world in which we live now. And what we can see about this world, it's kind of very much defined, but clearly alienated borders, fixed borders. Nation states have a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence in most cases, but they also have a legitimate monopoly on education, on taxation, on, in most cases, judiciary system as well. They are very clearly kind of structured in that sense. It's, everything that is happening within the nation state is nation states have their own public sphere, have own, everything is contained in that sense. And this other map is maybe even better in that sense because it kind of symbolizes, nations are symbolized by flags and all of these things. And we think of the world along these lines. We think of the world in terms of specific countries out there. And, we don't really have this geographical, natural understanding of the world as a globe, but we do kind of have this already in our minds, these categories that we understand that somebody comes from France and somebody comes from Chad and from Australia or China as specific nation states. So what we need to kind of, when we talk about nationalism, we have to treat nationalism as not as some sort of pathology or we cannot psychologize it or pathologize it, reduce it to some sort of individual attitudes and behaviors or personality traits. We need to treat it as a historical phenomenon. We need to understand, how we've come from this world. This is an 18th century world. And as you can see, this is a profoundly different type of organization of the world. There are no nation states. There are no fixed borders and boundaries. What we have frontiers of different empires. We have patrimonial kingdoms. We have city-states. We have sultanates, khanates, all sorts of other entities. We have lots of hunter-gathering groups and chiefdoms and many other things, but we don't really have nation states in any form. So this is a very different world, the way how it's organized, how it's structured. And also people in this world have thought very differently about the world in which they were born. So something has happened historically over the last 250 years that we started thinking completely differently about the world and about the people living in this world. So in that sense, we have to can dismiss the view that nationalism is some sort of a false consciousness or lie or deceit. It is a hegemonic view of the world. And if you look at the various surveys, constantly conducted, and there are obviously big issues with any survey, methodological and others, but let's say we'll take them with a pinch of salt. What we see is that surveys constantly show us that, since 1945 until present, the sense of attachment to nation state has grown constantly, has increased. And here we see, let's say yellow is, up to 100% of people think that, they're very much attached to their nation states. And it's really very few parts of the world where people are not as attached, under 80% or things like that. So this is we can look at other kind of similar surveys. Here is individually based in terms of countries, Qatar, Ghana, Ecuador, and green, dark green tells you that it's very well, strongly attached to their nation states, and the light green is attached. So when you combine the two, you again get about 80–90% of attachment to the nation state. This is a European Eurobarometer, which is constantly conducted, and again shows here how over the last, this has been conducted since 1960s, and what you see is a continuous increase in attachment to nation state. So in all 28 member states, more than 80% of respondents feel attached to their country. And in some countries, this is up to 99%, which is, this is a sign of hegemonic belief system. So this is something that we don't really, most people don't question. They think of it, they take it for granted in many respects. So we need to kind of look at this and try to understand that nationalism is not some sort of a moral failing. It is a hegemonic belief system. We do live in a nation-centric world in many respects. It's not a temporary aberration. It's not something, to be associated with the far-right politics. This is just an extreme version of the same thing. That's the problem. We pay attention to nationalism only when it's loud, but that's too late. Nationalism really is strong precisely because it's so embedded in everyday life. And that's the main thing for a sociologist, to try to understand how and why nationalism is so embedded in everyday life. So the key issue here is that this nationalism is a historical phenomenon. It's shaped, and I will argue, by a coercive organizational capacity, by ideological penetration, and by envelopment of micro-solidarity. So these are the three processes that I explore in my books and also in some articles, to try to see how nationalism remains so powerful. But before that, I'll just define nationalism. I see nationalism as a meta-ideology and social practice that posits the nation as a principal unit of human solidarity and political legitimacy. But nationalism is also more than that. It's also a way of talking, thinking, understanding the world, categorizing the world. So in that sense, it's a very powerful ideology because it naturalizes things. It takes things for granted. It normalizes these practices. There is this expectation that everybody has to have a nation. You can have more than one nation. Obviously, you might have more than one passport, but having no nation is not an option in the world in which we live. People look at you strangely if you say, I have no nation. Obviously, you do have nation. You're born somewhere, or whatever. So this is a very interesting and completely novel way of looking, historically speaking, novel way of understanding human beings and social relations. So nations are understood as self-evident and natural forms of social organization. And there is that view that every human being belongs to a particular nation, whether he or she likes it or not. So in that sense, we have to understand nationalism is not something to be confined to extreme right or left-wing politics, because there are lots of left-wing nationalisms as well. It's a principal mode of subjectivity in modern era, whether we like it or not. This is what we need to study. We need to understand. I call it dominant operative ideology of modernity, but I won't go into that. That's a slightly different topic. So why is nationalism so powerful and so embedded? There are a number of reasons. One of the key reasons is the organizational structure of the state, of the polity in which we live. So nation state has been dominant form of organized power in modernity and has been popularly regarded as the only justifiable form of territorial rule. So today in the world in which we live, there is, you cannot have officially an empire, you cannot also have a patrimonial kingdom or anything that has existed before. All states, even the small city states, have reframed themselves as nation states, like Singapore or Monaco or something like that, because we live in a world of nation states. So if you want to have a voice in this world, you have to be framed as a nation state. So this structure is really important. And if you look, UN is set up very much on the premise that there is no higher power beyond the sovereign nation state. And no other form of polity could make a legitimate claim for its existence. So in today's world, trying to establish an empire is impossible. Obviously, you can have an informal empire. You can influence different states and dictate geopolitics and things like that. But formal empire is not legit. Japan is the only nominal formal empire, but even in Japanese case, that's a very complicated historical reasons why it's called an empire. Nobody else is called an empire. Okay, so this is important. What's also important is that national sovereignty, the idea that people rule, is so ingrained and established that is naturalized and seen as inevitable, which obviously wasn't the case for much of history. Even if you look at the human prehistory and history, what we see, even if we discount kind of 200,000 years of existence of our predecessor as hominids, as hunter-gatherers later on, if we focus only on sedentary lifestyle, so that's the last 10 to 12,000 years, nation-state period counts for less than 2% of our existence on this planet, which is nothing. It's a blip in historical ocean. But what's interesting is that in these 2%, we've managed to create this unique understanding of the world that has never existed before. That's, we never had such a hegemonic understanding of the world before. So we had variety of worlds. If you look at even in 1914, this was still world dominated by empires. We had the nationalizing states in Europe and to some extent in North America, Japan, and a few other places, but much of the world was very much still imperial, defined by imperial possessions. Even if you look at the 1945, we still see lots of imperial possessions, and this is, in some respects, we can say that this is a cut point for the development of nationalism, nation states as a global movement. Before that, empires still dominate. Much of what is happening in the world was defined by imperial rule and various decisions. From 1945, empires are largely delegitimized, and nation state becomes this preeminent form of territorial and political organization. So we had empires for at least 5,000 years. We had patrimonial kingdoms, we had city-states, we had chiefdoms, we had everything else. And after 45, all of these are now largely delegitimized. They are not at the same level. They're either prescribed as empires or just integrated within the nation states as various city-states and chiefdoms and things like that. So we live in a very different world. We live in a nation-centric world in many senses. In organizational sense, we are all born in nation states, unless you are born in a kind of somewhere in the middle of Pacific or on the polar cap, which is now have become also a question of geopolitical struggle. We are all born in entities that are already defined as nation states, about 200 of those. And we also are raised in educational institutions that are created and established and recognized by specific nation states. Even if we go to private schools, they have to work according to programs set up by specific nation states. We are employed by nation states. Again, if we work in the private sector, again, this has to be regulated by nation states. We receive welfare provisions, health, all sorts of things through nation states. So our life is very much shaped institutionally by nation states, whether we like it or not. So in this context, when we talk about national identity, a concept that I don't like, this is a less question of personal choice, which people often think, oh, I feel this way. This is all to do with my own choice. So it's nothing to do with really, or less to do with emotional or cognitive response, and much more to do with organizational and ideological realities in the world in which we live. So we are all born in nation states. So this is shapes our thinking and understanding and viewing of the world. So we cannot talk about nationhood and nationalism as some sort of anomaly. Nationalism very much stands at the basis of modern social order, whether we like it or not. And precisely because nationalism is flexible and malleable ideology, it can adapt, it can change, it can move from left to kind of middle to the far right. And I'll talk about this a little bit more. Okay, if you look a little bit at the origins of nationalism, we know the kind of conventional story, you know, the intellectual roots in Enlightenment and Romanticism and political revolutions, French, American, and Latin American wars of independence of early 19th century. So a lot of kind of conventional historiography that we still learn in school textbooks focuses on the 19th century as kind of, this is the heyday of nationalism. But that's not the case. You know, 19th century is really the beginning of this process. It is a process, you know, that gradually, you know, here we have the imperial and the national still very much coexisting simultaneously. And what we will see when nationalism becomes a mass phenomenon, this is the 20th century and 21st century. I will focus now on three processes that have made this possible. First of all, as I mentioned again, we have to bear in mind that this is a historical phenomenon that has evolved and gradually developed with lots of kind of also tension and resistance. So nationalism didn't take roots lightly. There was all sorts of resistance from top and from bottom. And a lot of what has happened, it has happened through coercion, through wars, through coercive assimilation, you know, all sorts of different forces. And here is an example of, you know, we'll take a look just very briefly at some of these maps, which, you know, show us how the world, so the world is not just as, you know, what we saw 18th century global, you know, entities of empires and everything else, but also internally, you know, these states were internally profoundly diverse, you know, so these are the linguistic areas of France, and these maps are they're not really good in a sense because they paper over complexities internally because people spoke different dialects of Occitan and they were multilingual and trilingual. So the maps would have to be a little bit more, even more diverse than they're presented here. But let's use them as they are. So how nationalism became what it is, it was very much initially, developed through expanding this both vertically and horizontally. It started off as a minority elite project. It fought, obviously, the imperial aristocratic order, or imperial order before, and it gradually then incorporated different social strata. And then once this has happened on the kind of level of these specific states, that have then it continued throughout the globe. So in a sense, we can say that nationalist ideas and practices were slowly spread throughout the globe, often through imperial mechanisms. It's no accident that a lot of people from various colonies, would study in Paris and London and Amsterdam, and would pick up some of these nationalist ideas and then use them later on to articulate their own vision of a post-colonial world, you know, independence for Tanzania or Vietnam and all of these people. So nationalism and imperialism were very much, particularly in this period, still attached to each other. What is important, if you look at really, this is an image of France before the French Revolution. So we see a lot of diversity here. And this diversity was largely killed off through homogenization, coercive practices, through assimilation, through violence. We can see that obviously in other parts of Europe, which is often presented as this kind of, a culturally homogeneous states, nation states, but they all became homogenized pretty much through coercive practices, through coercive organizational capacity, increasing coercive organizational capacity. The so-called unification of Germany and unification of Italy had nothing to do with nationalist principles. These were imperial legacies. Prussia pretty much occupied the rest of what became unified Germany. We know Bismarck was not a nationalist himself, was very much against, having a common flag of Germany. So this developed only much later. So that's important to make that point, that nationalism didn't replace imperialism simply and overnight, and they were often very much in tension, and sometimes they were also part of the similar project. We can see similar things, obviously, in the case of Austro-Hungarian Empire, enormous cultural diversity. But again, this map doesn't really capture complexity because of the lots of multicultural and multilinguistic practices that people were part of, and also a variety of dialects that existed, but it still shows you how diverse it was. And you know, the whole idea of nation state was to how to kill off this cultural diversity and create homogenized entities. So initially, nationalism started off as a kind of anti-imperial project, was very much aligned with the progressive causes, with liberals, socialists, feminists, anarchists, Republicans, secularists. But by the late 19th century and early 20th century, we see more shifts towards the right. You know, again, strong link with imperialism, especially expansionist imperialism, you know, in Africa and other places. Colonialism, monarchism, fascism, eugenics, racism, you know, everything else that we saw. Okay, so what when we talk about nationalism, we have to focus on these three processes. First is looking at the way how organizational power has developed and has expanded. So without social organization, coercive social organizations, nationalism wouldn't really become what it is today. So it developed, it proliferated with the growth and expansion of organizational power. That's why I'm talking about organizational grounding of nationalism. So this is a long-term process. Again, don't have time to go into details because it is part of the ongoing process of cumulative bureaucratization of coercion, which has been around for 10,000 years, but it has intensified in the last 250, 300 years. Initially, nationalism was fairly much trying to attack the imperial state or monarchy state. So we have these secret revolutionary societies that have been extensively studied by historians, you know, like Italian Carbonari or Greek Society of Friends, and later on Turkish Committee of Union Progress. I mean, as these were, you know, they had these nationalist ambitions and goals, but they were very small. But they were still organizations which were determined to use violence in achieving these goals. More important were later on organizations such as larger social movements, which were able to penetrate societies much more deeply and bring in more individuals. And I often make reference to the way how Irish nationalism developed through establishing these kind of parish-based cultural and sport associations such as Gaelic League or GAA. And they really increased organizational capacity because they were present throughout society. So they had a organization everywhere, in every part of Ireland. And these were hierarchically parish-based structure of boards, committees, and councils. So you could take over ultimately, and they did take over the state. However, the most important entity for a development of nationalism is the state. So once you take over the state and you reorganize the state, then nationalism becomes important. A lot of kind of theories of nationalism tend to focus on separatist movements rather than looking at the mainstream nationalism, which really matters much more. So the rising organizational capacities of state provided, increased size in administrative, judicial, military, and police apparatuses. So we see, modernity is not just about, industry and technology. It is about, establishing these structures which can efficiently control population. So you need a large administrative and efficient administrative system. You need infrastructure in place, transport and communication networks. You need a police which is able to control borders. You need a lot of these different things in place to monitor your population. So nationalism requires all of these things. States are able now to use these coercive organizational powers to create more uniform, more standardized institutions and to kind of mold their citizens on these lines. So this is very important. These organizational capacities are very important. And we know, let's say the Stanford School, Mayer and others who have analyzed how, cultural institutions and other institutions have become very similar after the Second World War are very useful in that respect, because we find a lot of kind of research done here which show how after 1945, we use similar educational systems, similar, planning strategies, similar way of how railroads are organized, so many similar things. There is this global uniformity, but that also helps reinforce nationalist understanding of reality. So in addition to state, civil society does that too. Civil society groups from religious organizations, private corporations, NGOs, sport associations also are involved in kind of providing environment for nationalization of the everyday life, if you like. You know, they remember traumatic events from the past and, you know, glorified nationhood and all of that stuff. If you look at, let's say, some recent developments, you know, the last 3 crises that have taken place in European context, or in world context, they've all just showed how powerful nation states are. You know, if you look at the recession of 2008 and financial crisis, first reaction of governments was, protect their own banking systems. I'll go back here. So this is also, these are images in part from that period. Protect our own banks, our own economies. Despite all the kind of talk of neoliberal global economy, the first reaction was just protect our own, introduce banking guarantees and things like that. The similar thing has happened with the migration crisis. You know, borders, reinforce borders, suspend some agreements within the Schengen, introduce hard borders, more policing of immigrants. And then more recently with the pandemic, you know, we have that, so-called vaccine nationalism. First, we saw how borders were instantly closed. It shows you how overnight nation states can close border, can stop travel, can prevent everything. You know, it shows you how the power that we often don't see. And in crisis, it becomes very visible. During the pandemic, we saw that kind of struggle for medical equipment, ventilators. Now we see this, struggle for vaccines, and it shows how powerful nation states are, even the weakest of them. Okay, so if you look at, so this is the first thing is this kind of coercive capacity, which nation state is the key issue, but not the only one. The second issue is that nationalism requires ideological penetration within society. So it's not just the coercive organizational power, there is an also ideological power. It has to be ideologically grounded. And nationalism offers certain things to people. It projects these grand vistas of collective liberation, emancipation, and belonging. So it speaks that language that resonates with a lot of people. It invokes certain moral principles, liberty, equality, justice, fraternity from the French Revolution onwards, and often posits nation state as a kind of pinnacle of history. Often nationalist messages are couched in the language of righteousness. There is a certain reason, there is this morality behind it, why we need this, emphasizing this injustice of foreign oppression or sacrifices one's connationals, we need to respect them and things like that. So it provides popular justification and mobilization for social action. So this is a novel thing. It is quintessentially modern thing. If you look before nation states, what we see, we have very different forms of legitimacy. These are proto-ideologies. I call them proto-ideologies, such as mythologies of common descent. Obviously all patrimonial kingdoms invoke that, which is essentially religious justification, the right to rule, because there is this notion that kings were given this right by the religious figures, by God and whoever. Then we have also imperial narratives, we have civilizing missions, we have all sorts of other ways of justifying existence of a particular polity. It is only with nation states that people are invoked as having that right. Obviously, people don't rule, but somebody else rules in their name. But what matters also is that ideological penetration happened with the help organizational, increased organizational capacity. So nationalization of population has happened through military draft, military mass conscription that has happened throughout 19th and 20th century, where you brought people from different parts of the world, different parts of the country, and brought them together and forced them to learn, languages spoken by the dominant group. So standardized language, this is a point obviously made by Gellner and others, Anderson. You need to standardize languages. You need to kind of move away from these variety of dialects spoken in a particular territory and homogenize it. So you have a standardized language which is declared to be the official and only legitimate one. You have also compulsory literacy. So nationalism requires literate population to some extent. Standardized educational systems. Educational systems are crucial, as Gellner again made point. Affordable publishing, that Anderson mentioned, but also statewide welfare programs, increased infrastructure in transport and communication. All of these things are crucial to nationalize population, to turn them from these local attachments into this sense of being part of the same abstract project. So in that sense, national identity, if you can use that term, is a product of nationalism rather than the other way around, and of this organizational shell that is a nation state. We see this shift from status and kinship-based solidarity towards cross-class solidarity, at least in principle, of the nationhood. And we could see that also in these three recent crises, financial, migration, and pandemic. Again, we see constant calls for national unity. When economy was, before the 2008 crash, economy was seen as being kind of, in inverted commas, doing well, and everybody for himself, and it's good to invest and blah, blah, blah. Suddenly, crash created these new discourses where the governments would say, we are in this together. We should all, show a degree of solidarity, and we need to kind of address these problems. This affects us all. We have to sacrifice ourselves, and that was the austerity thing. Austerity is also linked very much in that sense with the discourses of nationalism. We saw similar things recently with the pandemic. Our brave health workers, our brave police officers, hardworking citizens making sacrifices for the nation and things like that. So the ideology is very important in that sense, but it has to kind of link with the organizational capacity. And the third process that I look at is kind of more micro-interactional one. I call it micro-interactional grounding or envelopment of micro-solidarity, because as human beings, much of our kind of daily life revolves around face-to-face interaction with the people that matter to us. Our families, our friends, our peers, lovers, and whoever. So in that respect, for nationalism, it's really important to penetrate this world, this micro world. And a lot of kind of scholarship on everyday nationalism and banal nationalism has tackled this issue, how we reproduce this in our daily discourse, how we, in routine talk that national categories are introduced, in ritual enactments of nation in everyday life. So all of these things are very important, but we have to kind of look at them a little bit more sociologically. This is not just a question of some sort of individual psychology. It's a question of how nationalism is able to kind of link the micro-solidarity of everyday life of people that matter to us with this kind of larger narratives with people that we show solidarity with people that we will never meet. This is Andersonian point of it. You'll meet only a few thousand people of your so-called nation, but you will feel attachment to millions of them, or billions in the case of India and China. So how is this possible? So what's crucial here is kind of making these links between these deep bonds, which require prolonged and dedicated small-scale face-to-face interaction, our families, friends, lovers, peers, or clan groups and things like that. And they are achieved, as Collins and other sociologists show, they require kind of this body tuning, physical harmonization when we interact with each other. Goffman has written about this extensively. So these are all really important, how we operate in small groups, in groups that matter to us. So how do you project this micro-solidarity onto the macro plane of nationhood? And this is not an easy thing, and that's why it requires there is all this organizational capacity that has built over the last 200 years. And also all this kind of machinery built around the kind of ideological processes. So what is crucial here is successfully to penetrate this microcosm of the family and kinship and peer groups and friendship, to envelop this micro-solidarity into the nationalist narrative. So ideology of nationalism, when it's successful, and it obviously it has been very successful in the last 200 years, it manages to translate these genuine micro-solidarities into these national identities that people feel. And then, this is what we saw, that up to 90% of people feel attached to their nation state, and this is increasing. And we can also take a look at how this process has operated and still operates in these three recent crises, the financial and the migration crisis and the pandemic. The notion of austerity that obviously was looming large after 2008 was framed along these lines of making sacrifices for the future of your children. You know, invoking this, you know, you have to do this, we have to pay off these debts in order for your children to you know, not be overburdened. So you look to the future of your children. So it invokes this micro-solidarity. People are obviously, most people have a very strong sense of emotional attachment and moral attachment to their family members, and particularly their children. And we see elements of that also with the pandemic crisis and the migrant crisis. Again, migrant crisis invoked that we have to protect ourselves. You know, there's this probable invasion. In pandemic, you know, we have to save our elderly, our parents, our grandparents, and our, you know, sick, you know. So it taps into this microcosm. You know, it taps into the world that matters to human beings, but it frames it nationally. It frames it, you know, it very much along the national principles. Okay, so I maybe went over the time. I'll just you know, conclude now. So these are just some of the you know, interesting findings, recent findings. If you look here, Australian consumers have shown a preference for Australian brands during the COVID-19 crisis, despite perceiving them as more expensive. So in a sense, you are willing to you know, sacrifice these personal costs in the name of the nation. So this is a really good example of how nation states can tap into the micro world and you know, frame it. You know, we need to sacrifice ourselves for others. So the key issue really for us, you know, this is the vaccination nationalism, and again, how it's framed very much. So in order for us really to understand how we've come to where we are, why do we live in this nation-centric world, we have to look at this, you know, longue durée, or, you know, how things have developed gradually over long periods of time. And this kind of ascendancy of the nation-centric understanding of social reality stems in part from the specific organizational changes, where the nation-state model has gradually replaced all other territorial competitors. There are no competitors left, legitimate ones left. There are no you know, classical empires. There are no patrimonial kingdoms. Everybody has to be a nation-state. And this is the only legitimate form of territorial rule, that, you know, nothing else is recognized. We had ISIS or a few other attempts to create something that is not a nation state, and it didn't last. And even ISIS tried to frame itself to some extent as a nation state, not nominally, because it rejected all nation states, but in the way how it was organized. So to understand the strength of nationalism in modernity, it's really important for us to explore these structural foundations, the historical, organizational, ideological, and micro-interactional groundedness. This is what when I analyze grounded nationalism. So even when we study banal nationalism, we have to bear in mind that this banal nationalism has a coercive foundations. You know, agency is important, but you know, there are historical reasons why we are where we are. Why is everyday nationalism present? You cannot study it outside of history, because history matters a great deal. It's not some sort of automatic and spontaneous response. It's organizationally mediated. You know, it depends on this ongoing organizational, ideological, and micro-interactional grounding. So nationalism is not likely to disappear. It's very much likely to expand, but it can obviously take so many different forms. It is embedded in modern institutions and organizations. It permeates our everyday lives. It's continuously reproduced in public and private sphere. And in that sense, whether we like it or not, we will continue to live in a nation-centric world. Okay, so I'll stop here now.
Thanks a lot. The conclusion is very significant, I would say. Yes. We can now stop with the sharing screen if you agree. Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. This was really comprehensive and rich insight into why we cannot put a nation aside actually today. I really enjoyed. I took a lot of notes. But before I give you some questions, I open floor now to the audience. If you have some questions, comment, please raise your hands or type here. We have one comment. Nebisha, if you want, you can ask the question directly. What do you exactly mean? No, I cannot see him. I have a bad internet. Okay, can you just ask the question? Yeah, there is a question in the comment in the chat. How about recent theoretical interpretation? Like, for example, well, there is a Mochnik text about theory of institution, state, and nation. Three theories. Maybe you can ask more directly what you want. Okay, Miloš Vukilić, please. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for your lecture. Although I read your books, it's always nice to hear the main arguments summarized by the author himself. So to be sure that those are the claims that I read. So I've written two comments about your claims. The first one is that I actually tend to disagree that Leah Greenfield, for example, is among the authors who deal with nationalism like it is only one of the consequences of modernization. She wrote, and I quote here, that historically the emergence of nationalism predated the development of every significant component of modernization, which means that in essence, she claims the very modernization is not only predated by nationalism, but that nationalism made modernism possible. Yes, and she's completely opposed in this way to Gilmer or other similar modernism thinkers, and her claims and findings seem to be completely in line with your main argument. If something is enabled by nationalism, then there is no way nationalism is not grounded in the ways you write. And the second comment, it is much shorter comment, that I find your arguments the arguments you elaborated are in line with international relations discipline up to a point. For example, James Mayall claims nationalism is one of the primary institutions of international relations. This means it is only one of the few institutions which must be adopted by an entity that strives to become or remain a state. So thank you very much for your books. And I found your book, Grounded Nationalism, to be particularly useful for my own PhD project. That's it.
Okay, thanks very much, Miloš. Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm familiar with Greenfield's work, although she has changed her position over the years. Her Five Roads to Modernity was kind of the original position, but she's moved much more to kind of psychological and biological interpretations in her latest books, which are kind of nationalism is in the mind and things like that. But if we move kind of to her original position, there are some overlaps, I agree, but her view is much more, she doesn't really focus that much on institutions, she doesn't focus at all on organizational capacity. So her argument is a kind of a Parsonian type of a Weberianism, where the focus is on belief systems. And nationalism is sort of a replacement of religion. And here, I think she has some similarity with early Anthony Smith, rather than, my focus is, if you look, in most of my books, particularly in the rise of organized brutality, I focus very much on coercive capacity. There's no nationalism with coercion, without kind of these coercive instruments that have to be in place. And we don't see that, for example, in her approach. Her approach is very different in that sense. She also doesn't really analyze this kind of micro interactional dynamic. She's not a sociologist. She kind of blends very much different disciplines. So my interpretation is very different from hers in that respect. And I have more skepticism of her later work, which is all biological, as I said, and psychological. The second point about IR, yeah, I mean, IR, the recent developments in IR have shifted away from the kind of a conventional realist and liberal takes on kind of nation state as the main actor of international politics. But IR doesn't look inside. What's more interesting for me, what's happening inside. So the consequences of framing nation state externally have an enormous, resonance internally. So IR obviously is a discipline that doesn't look inside of societies. But for me, what matters, this is all important for internally for societies. I don't really look outside so much, because that's not my focus as a sociologist. I'm looking internally, and I'm looking at similarities between them. And that's where the difference is. Although kind of recent IR, like, people who use historical sociology, George Lawson, for example, book on revolution is very much influenced by kind of historical sociology. And more recent IR, it has become open and sympathetic to sociology.
Quickly.
Okay, sorry for taking your time. That's actually, I wanted to say that recent IR is more prone to analyze what's within the states. It's not realism or liberalism anymore. For example, relationalism and Daniel Nexon and his analysis are always related to processes inside the states that affect international relations. So that's the only comment.
That's what I said. There are few new approaches, but I think the conventional IRA didn't really.
That's true. Thank you very much.
Okay, I invite other participants to raise their hand, but in the meantime, there is a Nebojša wrote in the chat. How about the nation zero institutions? I guess he's thinking in this text which he sent, Rasko Močnik is, he's speaking about nation, and there is a subtitle called Nation, Zero Institution in Individualistic Societies. So I don't know if you're familiar with this, but...
No, I'm not familiar with this concept, but I mean, the problem is with some of these interpretations that draw on kind of Marxist tradition in one way or another, is that they don't really see that power comes from different sources. So nationalism was very important in the communist world as well. I mean, I've written, my first book is all about this sort of comparing how nominally universalist ideas were very much underpinned and legitimized by invoking nationalist categories. So ideological legitimacy in the new states, it's all about that. So you have nationalism outside of capitalism. You have nationalism in North Korea. I mean, you have nationalism everywhere. So nationalism it has been, and obviously capitalism can work with nationalism, and I've talked a little bit about this. But even if you get rid of capitalism, you'll still have nationalism. So they are not. This is not the only source of nationalism.
Okay, thank you. While we wait somebody else also to say something, I would like to ask you something. When you're discussing about the nation states or something which is like a foundation of the modern world, what do you think about European Union? Whether this attempt to overcome nation states in a way was also modeled according to the model of nation states, or you think that in the case this would succeed, which is still very much under the question, would it be a different model offered on the international level, or this still resembles this model of nation states as you explain it?
Yeah. Obviously, EU is a complex, a patchwork of things and different influences and different processes involved in different groups, which, some are pulling in one direction, others are less keen on having something resembling a nation state. But I'm kind of more sympathetic to views that John Hall and a few others have developed, arguing really that nation states still are the backbone of EU, in particular powerful nation states like Germany and France, and until recently UK. So now when UK is gone, it started off very much as an attempt to reconcile conflicts between France and Germany, and then bringing on others. And it was obviously initially an economic project. It acquired some political elements, but it has never really become a cultural project. So in a sense, it doesn't resemble nation state in that respect. And it also developed much later, when populations have been fairly nationalized in much of Europe. So you don't really have a common education system for European Union. You have a very much nation-centric educational systems. You have standardized languages within the nation states. You have public sphere, which is very much nation-centric, mass media and everything else. So EU is another layer on top of nation state. It has worked really, despite all its big problems and issues, it has worked well in terms of counterbalancing national hegemony. So in that sense, it's been useful. And I think it is unique in that respect. We don't really have a similar type of, we had attempts to do, Hansa had elements of that, Hanseatic League in terms of bringing together different political entities. But this is a really unique experiment. It has been useful in preventing war, to some extent, at least within its own borders. I don't know how long it will last, but it was never really meant to replace nation state in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that there were attempts in that direction when we had this constitutional attempt to have European Union under one constitution, but obviously it failed at this point at least. There is one question in the chat. You argue nationalism depends in part on the rise of organization capacity. The organizational intensification of the nation state is fueled by the exploitation of fossil fuels. So how would you describe the relation between nationalism and the rise and defense of the fossil fuel-based energy economies?
Yeah, this is a very good question. I think it really deals with something that hasn't been really studied much, the relationship between nation state, nationalism, and environment. There are only really recently people have tackled. I've read a few articles on this recently by Daniel Conversi and a few others. And I think it's a very important thing, because if you look at the way how organizational capacity was increasing from 19th century onwards, it was very much at the expense of, kind of using environment to convert it into energy for building the state infrastructure. So the process was about homogenizing population, containing them and turning them, from peasants into Frenchmen. But at the same time is also about urbanization, industrialization, and the destruction of environment. And so you could say that nation-state formation was very much, has happened in most cases at the expense of the environment. When you find now all the kind of green nationalism, you often have, obviously from the 19th century, you do have invocation of nature as being kind of symbol of romanticism, return to roots. So in that sense, green ideologies, environmentalism can be used also against, some sort of liberal ideologies and everything else, for conservative ideology, for kind of more left-wing leaning arguments. But history of the nation state has been very much history of destruction of the environment. That is very much the case.
Thank you. We have one question from Caton McManus, if I'm pronouncing it well, and then Rock Sterger. So.
Hi, how are you? Sorry, my dog has just gone mad in the background here. It's just really a quick question, Siniša, around the role of institutions and how they respond to change and evolving sort of conceptualizations of nations and nationhood, or even nationality. I was just wondering, how do they respond? How do they change over time whenever you have this sort of traditional notion of what the nation is? How does that sort of relate to more contemporary modernist sort of versions of the nation?
Yeah, I mean, you can say that, as I mentioned, nationalism is fairly adaptable and malleable, and it does change, and the rhetoric changes. And we could see that obviously in the, just before these crises of 2008, nationalism was often framed in these kind of very liberal, inclusive terms of, often you have the rhetoric of multiculturalism and everything else, but still within the frame of nation states. So essentially, it is always about some form of assimilation in place. And you have, I mentioned that in a few articles that I've written, attempt nation state is a homogenizing machine. So it's very difficult. It's not very good at handling cultural difference. And, as you know, from being based in Belfast, this is a big issue when you're confronted with cultural difference, which has its own organizations and its own way of, organizing social life and political life. The nation states don't really know how to react to this because it's, they tend to try to homogenize populations whenever they can. Even the kind of the most multicultural states like Canada, or officially multicultural states like Bolivia and Peru, haven't really found a way to negotiate the cultural difference. There's always that sense of, using institutions, even if you have leaders who are sympathetic to kind of really try to accommodate others, the institution of the nation states are created in that way. They pull towards this homogenization, and that generates conflict, generates problems. So institutions change, they adapt, but this pull towards homogenization is always there. That's the problem, because this is the way how nation states are structured. If everybody's included, then what's the point of having nation state in the first place? I mean, that's the.
Thank you. Rock, the floor is yours. And then we have two more questions.
Yeah, thank you, Siniša, for this fascinating lecture. And you talked about persistence, about the persistence of nationalism, about how the nation states and nations and nationalism are kind of the norm these days. But interestingly so, we've seen that in the case of Yugoslavia, particular nationalisms can also, national identifications can also vanish rather quickly. So How do you explain that? Is there a paradox here, or does this have to do with this, with the fact that basically this institutional capacity just vanishes, and therefore these identifications vanish too?
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rob. This is a good question. Again, I deal with this to some extent in my first book, Ideological Legitimacy in the New State, where I tried to kind of compare experience of Serbia and Croatia in the early days of, after 1945 until 1960s, try to see, how the official ideology, which is fairly much framed along these universalist discourses, deals with this kind of nationalism that is already to some extent has been institutionalized there, and then how that resembles what has happened after the 1990s. So we do have as Rock knows that as a historian of the Austro-Hungarian period, what matters is the timing as well. So, something that you were able to do in late 19th century, you cannot do so easily in, let's say, mid-20th century or late 20th century, because you have a certain number of population which has also already been socialized in particular, discourses have raised new generations understanding themselves and conceptualizing themselves as in a particular way. So obviously the Yugoslav project was never conceptualized as a national project in a fully fledged sense. That was very clear, from the very beginning, that this was a negotiation between elites within the communist movement, and especially looking at the experience of the first Marxist Yugoslavia. They were trying to find a way how to balance this new state. And the person, obviously, as you know, who was crucial in creating this so-called nationality policy, Kardej, was very clear from the very beginning that there is no Yugoslav nation, in a sense that they're not really interested in building Yugoslav nation. You can say that some people, new generations that were born in, 50s, 60s, did develop a degree of identity or strong identity with Yugoslav state. But since you don't have organizational capacity anymore for this, you don't have this ideological penetration coming, it evaporated. I mean, and these people, they are still people who feel attachment to that state. There is no room for that. They are victims of this historical change. So in that sense, precisely because you don't have kind of organizations that would continue to exist to represent these groups, then you cannot have this Yugoslav project, in that sense.
We have two more questions. I would start with the last one because I think the first one we could finish with. How do you see the emergence of civilization states in China, Russia, India, Turkey? I'm not sure I understand the fully civilization states. Maybe.
No, I mean, we can see if you go to that map that I gave in the beginning from the 18th century, the world, how it looked like. It was very much world dominated by empires, and we have these kind of elements of imperial structures in place in China, elements of it still in Russia, India in a different way, maybe Turkey to some extent, and few other entities. So some national projects were built on the legacies of imperial structures. So we do see kind of how nationalism can use these imperial legacies to justify its existence. This is what is happening to some extent in contemporary world today in Turkey under Erdogan. The previous rhetoric of kind of highly secular Kemalist project has been now replaced by this kind of neo-Ottoman nationalism, but it's nationalism still. It evokes these legacies of Ottomanism, but it's not, imperial project. It's a national project. In China, you see that even despite the kind of communist invoking of the kind of communist principles, it is very much invoking, also making reference to imperial legacies of Chinese traditions and Confucianism and everything else. So these historical legacies do matter, and they're framed differently, but they're still framed in the national, along the national frames.
And the final question for this round, apart from the takeaway point that nationalism is here to stay, what are your opinions about the future changes in development of nationalism globally? So heading towards the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, obviously. We don't have a crystal ball to see how things will develop. I mean, nationalism is not a uniform phenomenon. It has always been changing, constantly will be changing. And it's also changing in relation to what's happening within society, what's happening globally. We saw European nationalism, how they became more far right in the context of the so-called migration crisis. Also, as Gazella has mentioned, these attempts to move European project towards nation states have also bounced to some extent, with some anti-European feelings and, framing the national discourse differently. Brubaker has written recently a few really good articles on how European nationalisms often use this kind of rhetoric of liberalism to dissociate themselves from the others. We are secular. So before it was the kind of conservative rhetoric of Christianity, blah blah blah. Now we are liberal, we are secular, and you are the others. You are inferior, and all of that. So nationalisms adopt to environment in which they find themselves, and we don't know what will happen. I mean, in different parts of the world, nationalisms will be different. I mean, we have also very left-wing nationalists, like in Scotland, Irish, a lot of kind of Sinn Féin nationalism in Ireland is very much uses discourse of leftism, anti-imperial rhetoric. A lot of kind of post-colonial nationalism is framed around the leftish ideas of anti-imperial project and so on.
Okay. Well, thank you. If there are no more questions, I want to particularly thank you for taking part in our Horizons of Freedom series of lectures. This was third in the row. Thank you very much for the discussion, and we hope that we are going to be able to host you also here in person very soon after we finish all these measures which are preventing us from traveling and being physically places.
Thank you very much, Gazella, and thanks everybody for attending and for asking very good questions.
Thanks also to audience for being with us today. Have a lovely day.
Thank you.